This is the story of Lucas Bennett and his wife, Vanessa Cole. A man named Harold reached out to us not long ago, Lucas's father. He said he'd been sitting on this story for a while, wasn't sure it was worth telling, but something about the way things finally landed made him feel like maybe someone else needed to hear it. He submitted it a few weeks ago, and we've been sitting with it since. According to Harold, it started quietly, the way most painful things do, with a comment at a dinner table that he almost let go. Almost. The emotional tone of what he shared is hard to name exactly. It isn't quite bitterness. It isn't quite triumph. It's something heavier than both. Here's how he told it. I'll try to explain it the way I remember, which means I'll probably get some of it wrong. The order of things, maybe, or the exact words. But the feeling of it that I remember clearly. On a Tuesday evening in late October, I sat across from my son at a dinner table that wasn't mine, in a house I hadn't been invited to warmly, eating food I hadn't been offered seconds of, and I heard the woman sitting next to him say something that I carried with me for the next 3 years, like a stone in my coat pocket. She didn't say it to me. That was the thing. She said it to Lucas, but she said it loud enough that I was meant to hear it. That's a particular kind of cruelty, the kind dressed up as a private conversation. Let me back up. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 61 years old. I drove long-haul trucks for most of my working life, and before that I did what a lot of men in my county did. Odd jobs, construction, whatever kept the lights on. My wife Patricia passed when Lucas was 14. After that it was just the two of us, and I won't pretend I was a perfect father in those years. I was tired a lot. I worked too much. I missed things I shouldn't have missed, but I loved him. I want that to be clear before anything else. Lucas is 34 now. He's smart in a way that I used to think was going to save him from every hard thing. The kind of smart that impresses people in rooms, that makes strangers feel immediately comfortable, that slides easily into whatever mold a situation requires. He got a degree in finance, got a job at a mid-sized investment firm in Charlotte, worked his way up to something with a title long enough that I could never remember it exactly, but always nodded it like I understood. He met Vanessa Cole at 28, married her at 30, and somewhere in that 2-year window, between the meeting and the marrying, I started to feel the distance. Not from Lucas, exactly. Not at first. It was more like a slow rearrangement. The calls got shorter, the visits less frequent. When we did talk, there was a new carefulness in his voice, like he was editing himself in real time. I told myself it was just the natural thing. A man building his own life, his own orbit. I believed that for a while. Vanessa Cole. I want to be careful here, because this isn't a story about a villain. I've thought about her enough over these 3 years to know that she was more complicated than the easy version of this story would make her. She was ambitious, which I don't hold against anyone. She was image conscious, which I understand in ways I probably shouldn't. She came from a family that measured people in increments of achievement, and she had absorbed that measurement system completely. The way children absorb the languages spoken around them, unconsciously, totally, and without much ability to question its grammar. She loved Lucas. I believe she loved him, but she also needed him to be a certain thing, and I was evidence that he might not fully be that thing. I was, in Vanessa's vocabulary, a liability. Not a financial one, to be clear. I wasn't asking for anything. I'd never once asked Lucas for money. I had my truck, my routes, a small house in a town called Millhaven that she had visited once and never returned to. I paid my bills. I kept to myself. But I was the kind of man whose hands had grease under the fingernails even after washing, whose truck was 15 years old, whose best jacket had been purchased at a department store during a sale. And in Vanessa's taxonomy of the world, these things meant something. They said something about where Lucas came from, and where Lucas came from apparently was somewhere she needed him to be moving away from. The dinner in October was Lucas's idea, I think. Or maybe it was framed as his idea and I was too glad about it to examine the framing. Either way, I drove 3 hours to Charlotte, put on my good shirt, and sat at a table in their townhouse that had been styled to within an inch of its life. Candles I wasn't supposed to touch, wine I wasn't supposed to finish. A kitchen that looked like it had been designed for a magazine shoot rather than actual cooking. Vanessa had made something with risotto. It was good. I told her it was good. She accepted the compliment like she was already somewhere else in her mind. The conversation moved the way those conversations do when nobody is quite saying what they mean. We talked about Lucas's work. We talked about a trip they were planning to Portugal. We talked about a renovation they were considering for the second bathroom. I contributed where I could. asked questions I thought showed interest, laughed when laughing seemed appropriate. Lucas seemed fine, present enough. He refilled my water without being asked, which felt like a small gesture of care, and I held on to it. Toward the end of the meal, while I was helping clear the plates, I heard Vanessa say to Lucas, in that particular undertone that is designed to exclude without being technically private, "You know you don't have to keep doing this." Lucas's response was too low for me to catch. "It's just," she continued, and her voice had the practiced patience of someone who has said a version of this many times before, "It's not like he brings anything to your life anymore. You've outgrown this, Lucas. You've outgrown the obligation." I stood at the kitchen sink with my back to both of them, and I kept washing the dish I was holding. I washed it for probably twice as long as it needed to be washed. The water was hot. I remember the heat of it on my hands, the specific sensation of choosing to stay still, to not turn around, to let the moment pass over me like a wave I had decided not to fight. I don't know what Lucas said after that. I turned off the water, dried my hands on the dish towel hanging by the oven, and walked back to the table and said I should probably get on the road before it got too late. Lucas walked me to my truck. We stood in the driveway for a minute in the cold. He hugged me. I hugged him back. "Drive safe, Dad. Always do." I pulled out of their neighborhood and drove about 4 miles before I pulled over into a gas station parking lot and sat with the engine running and didn't do much of anything for a while. The thing about a fracture is that it doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's already there, has been there for months, maybe years, and you simply haven't applied enough pressure to make it visible yet. The structure still looks intact. The walls still hold. You still move through the space like nothing has shifted. And then one day you lean on something you always leaned on, and it gives, and you understand that the giving didn't happen in that moment. It happened long before you noticed. My relationship with Lucas was like that in the year leading up to that October dinner. On the surface, we still had a relationship, calls on Sunday evenings, a visit at Christmas, the occasional text about something mundane, a game score or a news story or a photo of something he thought I'd find funny. The architecture of connection was still standing. But if you look closely, and I had started to look closely, the way you do when you feel something shifting without being able to name what, you could see the hairline cracks running through the mortar. The Sunday calls had gotten shorter. Not dramatically shorter. Nobody was hanging up abruptly or cutting conversations off. Just shorter in the way that matters more. The pauses had become less comfortable. The questions he used to ask about my routes, about Millhaven, about the neighbors I'd mentioned, about the book I'd said I was reading, those questions appeared less and less. He was still there on the other end of the line, still making the sounds of presence, but something attentive had gone quiet. I noticed it. I didn't say anything about it. That was, in retrospect, the first way I failed us both. I should say something about what my life looked like in that period, because I think it matters to the story more than it seemed to matter to anyone around me. I had been driving long haul for going on 20 years when Patricia died. After she passed, I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and the road had always been the thing that emptied my head of whatever was filling it. 3 years of that. Then my back started giving me problems. A compressed disc, 2 surgeries, the kind of thing that doesn't fully heal, but that you learn to manage, and I couldn't do the long routes anymore. Short regional hauls for a while. Then dispatch work for a small regional carrier out of Millhaven called Trident Freight. I knew their operation inside and out by then, knew the routes and the contractors and the timing rhythms of the whole thing, and it turned out I was useful in ways I hadn't expected to be. By the time Lucas was meeting Vanessa, I had moved from dispatch to operations management. By the time they married, I had bought a minority stake in the company with money I had saved over 15 years and never touched. I didn't talk about this much. Not because I was being secretive, but because it didn't feel like the kind of thing that needed announcing. I was a man managing a small freight operation in a town that nobody paid much attention to. It wasn't impressive by most measurements. Lucas knew I worked there. He knew I had some stake in it. He didn't ask many questions, and I didn't volunteer many answers. It was just the shape of my life, and the shape of my life had always been something we moved around, rather than looked at directly. Vanessa had met me twice before the October dinner. Once at a birthday party of Lucas's a year before they married, a dinner at a restaurant where she had been pleasant in the controlled way of someone auditioning you while pretending not to, and once at the wedding itself, where the chaos of the day had meant we'd exchanged only a few words. Both times I had walked away with the impression of someone sharp and watchful, someone who processed information quickly and filed it efficiently. She had looked at my truck in the restaurant parking lot the first time with an expression I had cataloged and then tried to forget. The October dinner was the third time, and it was supposed to be, I think, a kind of formal integration, a proof that this family unit was functional and connected. What it actually was, I understood only in the parking lot of that gas station, engine running, hands resting on the steering wheel, was a kind of assessment, and I had failed it. There was a man named Derek who I want to mention because he becomes relevant later, Derek O.C. He was Vanessa's closest friend from college, a man who had made real money in commercial real estate and wore the kind of confidence that comes from never having needed to wonder whether you belonged in a room. He had been at the birthday party that first time I met Vanessa, and I had gotten the impression that she used him as a kind of standard, a benchmark for what male success was supposed to look like. Lucas admired Derek, Vanessa adored him. And Derek, for his part, was friendly enough to me in the brief interactions we'd had. A handshake, a few minutes of polite conversation, but there was always a register underneath the friendliness that communicated a clear hierarchy. He knew what I did. He knew what I drove. He had computed the equation and arrived at a number. I drove home to Millhaven that October night thinking about Derek without entirely meaning to, about how he moved through rooms, about the way Vanessa's voice changed slightly in pitch when she referenced something he'd said or done, about what it would mean to Lucas, long-term, to be married to someone who used that particular man as a North Star. The house in Millhaven was quiet when I got home. It's a small house, 3 bedrooms, a porch that faces east, a kitchen that I've repainted twice and never been fully satisfied with. I had lived there since before Patricia died, and there were still things in it that were hers. A quilt on the spare bedroom bed, a mug she'd picked up at a craft fair, a small ceramic rabbit on the windowsill above the kitchen sink that I had never moved and never would. I made coffee I didn't really need and sat at the kitchen table and let myself feel what I had been not feeling for most of the drive home. It wasn't quite grief, it wasn't quite anger. It was something older and more familiar than either of those. The feeling of being found insufficient, of being measured and coming up short. I had felt it before, in other contexts, in other rooms. I had always found my way through it. But sitting at that table at 11 at night, with my good shirt still on, and the coffee going cold, I wasn't sure what finding my way through it was supposed to look like this time. My phone showed no messages from Lucas. I hadn't expected any. That was the part that I kept coming back to in the weeks that followed more than anything Vanessa had said. Not the cruelty of her assessment, which I could catalog and set aside, but the silence from my son, the fact that he had hugged me in that driveway and said, "Drive safe," and then said nothing. The fact that whatever she had said at the table, whatever version of what she'd said to him had been said before, privately, in the particular intimacy of a marriage where one person has decided something. It had not yet produced a pushback from him that I was aware of. Maybe it would, I told myself that. I lay in bed that night and told myself that Lucas was his own man, that he was processing, that the fact that he called at all meant something, that a single dinner was not the whole story. I believed it partly I believed it. What I knew, without knowing I knew it yet, was that I was about to make a decision. Not that night, not consciously, not with any clear intention articulated even to myself. But something in me had shifted on that drive home, the way a river shifts after a flood. The banks are in the same place, but the channel runs differently. I was going to do something. I didn't know yet what. I got up at 5 in the morning, as I always did, and drove to the Trident freight yard and started my day. The calls stopped in January. Not all at once. Not with any announcement. It was more like the Sunday evening window became a Sunday evening maybe, and then the maybe became a sometimes. And then the sometimes became a silence that I eventually stopped waiting inside of. By February, I had gone 3 weeks without hearing from Lucas directly. He texted twice, once to say Happy New Year, a week late, and once to send me a photo of a snowstorm in Charlotte with a comment about how he couldn't believe it. I responded to both. He didn't respond to my responses. I called once, on a Sunday in the second week of February, and it rang through to voicemail. I left a message. Nothing alarming, nothing that asked for anything. Just that I was calling to check in, that I hoped he and Vanessa were well, that I was around if he wanted to talk. He texted back the next day, busy period at work. I'll call soon. I said okay, I meant it. I gave him the room. Soon turned out to mean 6 weeks. When he did call in late March, the call lasted 11 minutes. I know because I looked at it afterward. Looked at the duration the way you check a temperature reading, trying to understand what it indicates. He sounded well. He told me about a project at work, about a weekend trip they'd taken to Asheville, about a new restaurant in their neighborhood he thought was overrated. He asked, once, how things were in Millhaven. I said, fine. I started to say something about Trident, something about a new contract we'd just secured, a real one, the kind that had me genuinely excited in ways I wasn't sure I'd been in a while, and I heard the slight change in his breathing that meant he was multitasking, was looking at something else while I talked, and I shortened what I was going to say and asked him something about Asheville instead. After the call, I sat with the 11 minutes for a while. It wasn't that he didn't love me. I want to be clear about that, because this story could easily turn into the kind of story where the father decides he's been abandoned and acts accordingly, and that's not quite what it was. It was more complicated than abandonment. He was in the middle of a marriage that had a gravity of its own, a marriage with a woman who had clear ideas about the shape life was supposed to take, and he was trying to be good at that marriage the way he was good at most things, by conforming to its requirements, by becoming what it needed. And what it needed, apparently, was a version of Lucas that was a little lighter on the past, a version that had fewer tethers to Millhaven, to long-haul routes, to fathers who drove 15-year-old trucks, and had dinner conversations that didn't map onto the world Vanessa was building. I don't think Lucas was malicious about this. I think he was in the particular way of people who love too much in two directions at once, just trying to manage a tension that felt unmanageable. I think every unanswered call was accompanied by a genuine intention to call back. I think he thought about me more than his behavior indicated. I think he told himself regularly that things would settle, that it was just a season, that the distance was temporary. I think he mostly believed it. And I think Vanessa made it easy for him to believe, because that is what a certain kind of influence does. It doesn't command. It simply makes one direction feel more natural than the other, until the direction becomes a habit, and the habit becomes a life. This is the part of the story I find hardest to tell, because it's the part where I did something that surprised me, where I acted in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. In April of that year, about 6 months after the October dinner, 4 months into the drift, I called my attorney. Her name is Margot Flynn, and she had handled Patricia's estate and a few small business matters for me over the years, and she was the kind of lawyer who asked direct questions and didn't waste time being delicate about the answers. I drove to her office in Crestfield, about 40 minutes from Millhaven, and I sat across from her desk and told her I wanted to restructure things, not because I expected anything in particular to happen, not in some calculated anticipatory way. I want to be honest about that. What I felt, driving to Margot's office, was closer to a quiet animal instinct than to any conscious strategy. The instinct of a person who has seen how things can go, who understands that the world is less stable than it appears, who has spent enough time thinking about legacy to know that the thinking needs to be followed by action. The October dinner had done something to that instinct, activated it, maybe, made it impossible to keep putting off. The thing about Trident Freight, the thing I hadn't fully explained to anyone, including Lucas, was that it had grown, substantially, in ways that had surprised even me. We had started in regional short haul, small contracts, reliable margins, nothing spectacular. But over the past 4 years, driven partly by changes in the logistics industry, and partly by decisions I had made with a clarity that surprised me when I looked back at it, Trident had expanded. New contracts in pharmaceutical distribution, a segment I had identified early as underserved in our region. A partnership with a larger national carrier that gave us access to contracts we couldn't have won alone. A small acquisition, a struggling refrigerated transport company that, once stabilized, had opened up an entirely different revenue stream. The minority stake I had bought years earlier had converted, through 2 rounds of reorganization, into a majority. I now owned 62% of a company that, by the previous year's audit, was valued at somewhere between $8 and $12 million, depending on the metric you used. I had not told Lucas this. Not the numbers, not the scale of it. He knew I was at Trident. He didn't know what Trident had become. Margot didn't blink at the numbers. She asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself, made notes in her precise handwriting, and then said, "What are you trying to accomplish here, Harold?" I thought about it. Not performing thought, actually sitting with the question. "I want to put it in his name," I said. "Eventually. I want it to be his." "Through what mechanism?" "Gradually. However makes the most sense structurally. I want him to own it when the time is right, without—" I stopped. "Without?" Margot waited. "Without it being conditional on anything. Without strings. I want him to have it because he's my son and it's what I have to give. Whatever else is going on between us." She looked at me for a moment with the specific expression of someone who is deciding whether to say something or not. Then she said, "I'll draw up some options. We didn't talk about Vanessa. I hadn't mentioned her name. But Margot was smart, and I had the feeling she had read the subtext with a precision that made the explicit unnecessary. She had always been good at the parts between the lines. I drove home with something settled in my chest that hadn't been settled before. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like intention. The feeling of a man who has decided on a direction and has begun moving, even if the destination is still unclear. That spring was the last time I heard from Lucas for 4 months. He called in August on my birthday, and the call lasted 7 minutes. He sounded fine, present enough. He wished me happy birthday, told me there was a lot going on, said he'd explain more when things calmed down. I thanked him for calling. I meant it. After I hung up, I sat on the porch facing east and watched the light change in the way that late August light changes. Slowly golden, with that particular heaviness that makes everything feel significant even when nothing particular is happening. I thought about Patricia, about what she would have made of all of this. She had always been better at Lucas than I was. Better at the emotional maintenance, the checking in, the invisible work of keeping a relationship tended. Without her, I think Lucas and I had both been winging it in ways we didn't fully acknowledge, patching things up with routine and assumption rather than with actual tending. Maybe that was on me. Maybe I should have worked harder at the closeness after she died, built something more durable between us while I had the chance. I've replayed that question more times than I can count. I don't have a clean answer. "I don't know," I said to no one in particular, sitting on that porch. "I don't know, maybe." And then I stopped, because I had been about to say something about sharing this, about whether any of this matters to anyone else, and that felt strange to say out loud, even alone. Even writing it now feels strange. Maybe like this story deserves to be heard by someone. Maybe that's why I'm telling it. I went inside and called Margot about the next steps in the restructuring. The confrontation, if you can call it that, because it was too quiet to really be called that, happened in September, almost a year after the October dinner. Not at their house this time. At a coffee shop in Charlotte, which read like a deliberate choice on Lucas's part. Neutral territory. A place where the absence of domestic context made certain things easier to say. He had called 3 days before and asked if I could come down. Not in the way of a visit, in the specific, weight-carrying way of someone who needs to say something and is building toward it. I said yes. I drove down on a Saturday morning and met him at a place called Forge Coffee near his neighborhood. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window, with a drink he'd barely touched, looking out at the street with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something. He stood when he saw me. We did the hug. He waited until I had ordered and sat down. "I'm not sure how to do this," he said. "Take your time," I said. He looked out the window again, then back at me. Vanessa thinks it would be better if I had less contact for a while. With you." He stopped, worked his jaw slightly. "She thinks it's healthier. That the relationship isn't. She says it's not a healthy dynamic for me." I waited. She doesn't mean it as a judgment of you, she says. "It's more about she thinks I carry a lot of guilt and obligation that isn't good for me and that," he exhaled. "I'm saying this wrong. What's the right way to say it?" He looked at me directly then. "She wants me to cut contact." The coffee shop hummed around us. Somewhere behind me a machine was steaming milk. A woman at the counter was laughing at something the barista had said. "What do you want?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I became aware of the exact quality of his silence, its texture, the effort it contained, the things moving through it that didn't have words yet. "I don't know," he said. "That's an honest answer. I don't know." "Okay, that's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say, Lucas?" He ran his hand across the table. A gesture without object, just the need to move something. "I thought you'd, I don't know, fight. Push back. Tell me she's wrong." "Is she wrong?" The question landed like I didn't intend for it to land. He blinked. I'm not asking to provoke you, I said. I'm asking because you're the one who has to decide what's true, not me. I can't tell you what your own marriage feels like from inside. She's not a bad person, Dad. I know. She grew up in a family where there were very particular ideas about things. About what success looks like, about... He stopped again. I'm not defending her. You don't have to. Or you can. Either way. He stared at the table. I love her. I know you do. And I love you. I know that too. The milk steamer went again. The woman at the counter had stopped laughing. So what do we do? He asked. I thought about Margot. About the documents we were working through. About the restructuring that was, at that point, half completed. The first significant tranche already moved. The mechanisms in place. The company that he didn't fully know he was slowly inheriting. I thought about whether to say any of it, decided not to. I think, I said carefully, that you should do what you need to do. Take the space, if you need it. I'm not going anywhere. The door in Millhaven opens the same way it always has. He looked up. That's it? What else is there to say, son? He looked like he might cry for a moment. He didn't. He pulled it back in the way men his age are still doing. That half-performed composure that isn't quite natural but has been practiced long enough to pass. I don't want to lose you, he said. You won't, I said. Whether I believed that fully in that moment, I'm not entirely sure. What I believed, more than anything, was that the conversation had to end here. Not because I was finished saying things, but because the things I wanted to say would not help him. That there were moments when love meant containing itself, and this was one of them. We finished our drinks. We talked about nothing of consequence for 20 minutes, a form of recovery, both of us grateful for it. When I left, he walked me to the truck again, the same as October, the same embrace in the cold that was now by a few degrees a different season. I'll call, he said. When you're ready, I said. I drove out of Charlotte with the windows down, even though it was only 55 degrees. The cold air helped. I needed something external to manage what was happening internally, and the cold was clean and simple and asked nothing of me. Called Margot from a rest stop outside of Crestfield. Move faster, I told her. She didn't ask why. How much faster? As fast as is legally clean and structurally sound. I can have the next phase drafted by the end of the month. Good, I didn't explain anything else. She didn't need me till 14 months passed. Lucas called 4 times in that period, not 0, 4. On my birthday again, at Christmas, once in the spring with no occasion attached that I could identify, and once in June to tell me, briefly, that Vanessa had been promoted to a senior director position at her firm and that they were celebrating and he wanted me to know. I said I was glad for her. I meant about 60% of it. Each call I treated the same way, warmly, without pressure, without any reference to what had been said in the coffee shop. I asked about his work. I laughed at the appropriate moments. I said I was well when he asked, which was mostly true. I did not mention Trident. I did not mention Margot or the documents or the fact that the restructuring was, by that point, fully complete. I want to describe what those 14 months actually looked like, because they tend to get flattened in retrospect into a period of simply waiting, and that's not quite accurate. I worked. More than I had worked in years, in a way that surprised people around me, though I'm not sure it surprised me. There was something clarifying about the September coffee shop conversation, about the October dinner that preceded it. Not a clarification I would have chosen, but a clarification nonetheless. When certain things are no longer ambiguous, when the shape of a loss is finally visible, the energy that was spent on hoping and interpreting and leaving room for things to be other than they were, that energy has to go somewhere. I put it into Trident. We expanded into a third region. We brought on a logistics software system that I had been skeptical of initially. And that turned out to be transformative, cutting coordination time, improving route efficiency in ways that went directly to margin. We won a contract with a regional hospital network that was the largest single contract in the company's history. By the end of those 14 months, Trident Freight was not quite the same company it had been the year before. It was worth more, significantly more, and it was more stable, less dependent on any single contract. More diversified in a way that made the valuation feel real rather than theoretical. I also took long walks, which sounds simple, but it wasn't something I had historically done. Patricia had been the walker in our marriage. She'd always gone out in the evenings, through the neighborhood, sometimes asking me to come, sometimes not. After she died, I'd kept meaning to take it up as a practice and never quite had. In those 14 months, I did. Every evening after work, about 45 minutes through the part of Millhaven that backs up against a stretch of converted farmland, where in the right light the sky does something that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone. On those walks I thought about Lucas more than I thought about anything else, not with the specific, pointed quality of grief, but with something that felt more like tending, keeping something warm that was waiting for the right conditions to come back to life. I thought about him as a boy, the particular quality of his attention before it became the performance he'd later learned to make of it. I thought about the way he used to call me from college at strange hours, not for anything specific, just to talk, just to have the sound of a voice he knew in an environment that was still becoming familiar. I thought about the person he was under the person he was trying to be, and I held on to my belief that those two people were not as far apart as Vanessa had made them seem. What was Vanessa doing in those 14 months? I learned this in pieces later, in the ways you learn things that happened at a remove through reconstruction rather than observation. She had, apparently, arrived at a version of the Harold Bennett story that satisfied her. In this version, the distance had been the right call, a necessary pruning of an attachment that had been holding Lucas in a psychologically limiting relationship with his past. She cited this, evidently, to friends, to Derek, possibly to therapists who are contractually useful for this kind of reframing. She had replaced the discomfort of the action with a language that made it feel like care, a thing done for Lucas's benefit, for the health of their unit, for the clarity of their forward direction. I know this because Lucas, much later, described it to me in the precise, careful way of someone reporting facts they find uncomfortable but feel the obligation to be honest about. She had not, he said, expressed doubt about the decision. She had not wondered if I was okay. She had, over time, grown comfortable with a version of me that was essentially a symbol, the symbol of where Lucas had come from, of a past that the arc of his life had properly transcended. Lucas, for his part, was less settled. He wouldn't have called 4 times in 14 months if he were settled. There was something in him that wasn't quite at peace with the shape of things, and it came through in the texture of those calls. The slight effort in his voice, the specific warmth he deployed with me that was warmer than his ordinary warmth, as if he were compensating for something. I didn't name this in the calls. I let him have what he was managing. The marriage, meanwhile, I can only say what I know from the outside, which is that by the spring of the second year, something was changing inside it in ways that apparently remained invisible to Vanessa longer than it did to Lucas. He would call it later a weight, a particular kind of marital weight that comes from living with someone whose image of you is so fixed that it becomes its own kind of pressure. Vanessa had needed him to be a specific thing, had organized her life and her self-image around his being that thing, and the longer they were married, the more the specificity of her need made him feel. This is his word, managed. Not in a calculating way, in the natural way of someone who has a clear idea of the good and genuinely believes they are helping you toward it, but managed nonetheless. And there is a kind of management, however well-intentioned, that makes a person feel less real over time. He started questioning things in the way that a person does when they've been quiet for too long, and the quiet begins to feel like a lie. He questioned the friends they spent time with. Derek and Derek's world, always Derek's world, a world of boats and investment returns and conversations that moved, he said, like they were being performed for an audience. He questioned the renovation, which had happened, and which he found he couldn't quite care about in the way he was supposed to. He questioned, at some point around month 11, why he had not called his father in 2 months. He called that month. That was the spring call, the one without occasion. I didn't know, when I picked up the phone, that it was the result of a questioning that had been building. I just knew he sounded different, a little freer, a little less edited. We talked for 40 minutes. I did not tell him what I knew, which was that the documents had been finalized 2 months earlier. That Trident Freight, in all its current configurations, was now held in a trust structure that named Lucas Bennett as primary beneficiary, a structure that would fully transfer upon my death or upon a triggering condition that Margot and I had defined as my voluntary decision to retire. I held that information in me and let it sit there while we talked about other things, about the walk I'd taken that morning, about a book he was reading, about a memory he had of us driving somewhere together when he was 9 that had apparently surfaced recently and stuck with him. After that call, I went out to the yard behind the Trident office and looked at the trucks lined up in the late afternoon light and thought, he's coming back, not tomorrow. Not in a way I could predict or plan around. But the version of him that had been in that call was the version that would eventually find its way home. I believed that with a completeness that surprised me. 13 weeks after that call, Lucas called again and told me that he and Vanessa were separating. He said it plainly. Not with drama, not with the collapsed voice of a person in crisis. With the measured steadiness of someone who had been arriving at the truth for a long time and had finished arriving. We're going to separate, he said. We've been talking about it for a while. It's the right thing. I'm sorry, son. I think I am too, he said. But I don't know. I might be okay. You will be, I said. How do you know? Because I know you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I should have called more this year. I know that. Another quiet. Yeah, he said. I did. The lawyer called on a Thursday in February, about 4 months after Lucas told me about the separation. It had been a slow morning at Trident. January had been quiet, as January usually was, and February was starting to find its footing. I was in my office going over route projections when my cell phone rang with a Charlotte area code I didn't recognize. Is this Harold Bennett? The voice was professional, practiced, projecting the particular authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in a transactional conversation. Speaking. My name is Gerard Fassbend. I'm a family law attorney in Charlotte. I represent Vanessa Cole Bennett in her divorce proceedings. I waited. I'm reaching out regarding an asset disclosure matter that's come up in the proceedings. I understand you have some involvement with a company called Trident Freight? I do, I said. Your son Lucas has disclosed a potential inheritance interest in that company in his asset statement, and as part of due diligence, I'm reaching out to confirm the nature and scope of that interest. The tone of the call was still professional, still projecting that transactional authority. There was an assumption underneath it. I could feel it in the slight efficiency of his language, the brisk way he had summarized the purpose, the absence of any real preamble that this was a minor item. A detail to be confirmed and filed, a box to be checked. The assumption, as best as I could reconstruct it, was that he was calling a retired truck driver in a small town about a modest asset that could be valued quickly and added to a column. Okay, I said. What would you like to know? Can you confirm the nature of the trust structure and the approximate value of the interest your son stands to inherit? I leaned back in my chair. Through the window of my office, I could see the Trident yard. 12 trucks currently on site, 4 more on routes, the new refrigerated units we'd acquired last year lined up against the east fence. The morning light was hitting the equipment in a way that made it look, briefly, like something impressive. The trust is fully established, I said. It was finalized approximately 22 months ago. Lucas is the sole beneficiary. The terms allow for full transfer either at my death or upon my voluntary retirement, and the value Fassbend began. The company was valued at $11.3 million at the last audit, I said. The audit was done 8 months ago. The valuation is likely higher now, given contracts we've added since. Margot Flynn in Crestfield handled the structuring if you need to verify through legal channels. The silence on the other end of the line was a specific kind of silence. Not confusion exactly, more like a recalibration. The sound of a professional encountering a number that had not been in the scenario they had prepared for. I'm sorry, Fassbend said. Did you say 11 million? 0.3, I said, at last audit, another silence. Then, and this trust was established, you said 22 months ago? Give or take, prior to the separation proceedings. Prior to any conversation about separation as far as I know. Prior to a lot of things. He asked several more questions, precise and professional, while he recalibrated. I answered each of them plainly. I didn't perform anything, no satisfaction, no irony, nothing that could be characterized as gloating. I gave him the facts in the order he needed them and let the facts be what they were. After he hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand and looked at the yard through the window for a while. I thought about Vanessa, not with triumph, which would have been easy, and which I had maybe imagined feeling in some version of this moment, in the times I'd let myself imagine it. But the actual emotion was quieter than that, and more complicated. She had made a calculation about me, about what I was and what I was worth, and what it meant for Lucas to be tethered to me, and the calculation had been wrong. Not because I had set out to make it wrong. It had been wrong because her metric was wrong. because she had been measuring a thing she didn't understand with a tool that wasn't designed for it. And I couldn't quite find satisfaction in that, the way I might have expected to, because it was also just sad. It was the sadness of someone who had been so certain of the formula that she hadn't thought to check whether she was solving the right equation. I thought about Derek Ossie, who I had spoken to exactly three times in my life, and who had nonetheless occupied a strange amount of cognitive space in my thinking about all of this. His kind of success, visible, calibrated, easy to reference in a dinner party conversation, had been the template, the ceiling or the floor or the standard, depending on where you stood. I had not been that kind of success. My kind had been slower, less photogenic, more concerned with the internal logic of a freight operation than with the story it told at a distance. That wasn't virtue, it was just the way I was built, but it had produced something real. Lucas came to Millhaven the following weekend. He drove himself, which was the first time in at least 3 years that he'd made that drive without it being attached to an occasion. He arrived on a Saturday morning in the early light, parked behind my truck, and sat in his car for a minute before getting out. I had seen him pull in from the kitchen window and had stayed where I was, at the stove, managing not to go out and meet him like I wanted to, giving him the moment. He knocked even though he'd had a key his whole life. I let him knock and then opened the door. He looked thinner, tired in the way of someone who has been sleeping but not resting. But his eyes were clear, and there was something about his posture that was different from the last time I'd seen him. Less organized around some external expectation. He was wearing a jacket I'd given him years ago that I'd assumed he'd long since gotten rid of. "You kept that," I said. He looked down at the jacket like he'd forgotten he was wearing it. "Yeah," he said, "I don't know. I made eggs." He sat at the kitchen table where I'd sat on the night I drove back from that first October dinner, and watched me cook with the specific quiet of someone who is allowing themselves to just be somewhere without managing what being there means. He asked about Trident. Actually asked, the way he used to before, the questions with follow-ups and genuine curiosity in the follow-ups, I told him. Some of it, the shape of it. He listened in a way that made me believe he was genuinely hearing it. "I didn't know," he said, not accusatory, wondering. "You didn't ask much." "I should have. You had a lot going on." He looked at the ceramic rabbit on the windowsill above the sink. He hadn't looked at it in years, I was sure of it. He looked at it now for a long moment. "Mom would have liked this," he said. Meaning the company, I thought. Or maybe meaning the morning. Or maybe the rabbit, still there after all this time in the same window. "She would have," I said. We ate breakfast. After, we sat on the porch and had coffee and watched the morning happen, the way morning happens in that part of Millhaven. Slowly, without urgency. A dog across the street was investigating something in a neighbor's yard. A car passed. The light was moving through the tree at the edge of my property in the particular way that February light moves when it's trying to be something warmer. He told me about the separation. Not all of it, some of it, the parts he could manage. He said she was going to be okay. He said he was going to be okay. He said the lawyer had called him after the call to me, somewhat bewildered, and that the conversation that followed had been his word, revealing. Not about the money, about the premises. About the way she had constructed the story and what the construction had required her not to see. She really thought. He stopped. "I know," I said. "She wasn't trying to be. I know that too." He looked out at the yard. "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it, for being absent, for letting that happen." I held my coffee mug and watched the dog across the street complete its investigation and trot back toward the house. The morning light was doing something beautiful with the bare tree at the edge of my property, and I stayed with it for a moment before answering. "You're here now," I said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. We sat on the porch in the February cold for another hour without talking much, which was the most we had communicated in years. I wasn't sure how to end this when I started writing it down. I'm still not entirely sure. What I know is that the things that mattered didn't happen in the moment the lawyer called. They happened in a parking lot at a gas station outside Charlotte, in an empty house at 11 at night, in 45-minute walks along converted farmland in a light that defied description. They happened in the slow, unglamorous work of continuing to show up for a son who wasn't showing up for me, continuing to build something real in a place that nobody was watching, continuing to believe that patience, when it isn't just waiting but is actually living fully inside the wait, is its own form of strength. Vanessa measured me and came up short. That's her story. Mine is different. Mine is about a boy in a jacket he kept for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, sitting at a table where his mother's mug still lived, looking out at a yard that had always been exactly what it was. Nothing hidden, nothing performed, just solid and there and waiting. I think she missed the thing she was trying to find. I think she looked right at it and didn't see it, because it didn't look the way she expected it to look. I think about that sometimes, driving into Millhaven in the early morning, the trucks already heading out, the yard already moving. I think about what it means to look at a thing and not see it. And I think about my son who looked at his jacket and put it on anyway, and drove 3 hours without being asked, knocked on a door he had a key for. That's what I'll take from all of it. That's enough.